All right, just a little bit more for us to learn about our basic flat list. So in the previous two videos, we learned how to set up a flat list, how to get some data in there, and also how to set it up so that way our styling was conditional based on which item was selected. The last item that I want to talk about is this item separator component. And the way that this works is it lets you specify a custom component that you want to go in between the rows. So it won't go before the list begins or after the last row, it just goes in between them. Now, a couple things to point out here. For starters, this prop starts with a capital letter, and that is unique. Most of our other props start with a lowercase letter, and that's because we are we're essentially saying what component we want to render in this place. And since components start with capital letters, that's why this starts with a capital also. Now, if you are creating a custom component that doesn't have any props, you can simply put the name inside curly braces like we see here. However, if you are using a custom component that does take a prop, then you have to use the full function notation. You cannot use the shortened notation. So in this case, I'm saying the functional component that I want to assign for the item separator component is, it is going to have a parameter, or rather it's going to have this list item separator and take in a prop of the color being red. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we are going to make another file for this component, and then we will build up our code. All right, so if we go back to our project in our components folder, we want to make another file, and I'm going to call this one list item separator.tsx. And just like we have done, did I already make that file? Apparently I already made that one. I can't remember what I did earlier. And when we made this one before, we used that RNFES shortcut to generate this stub code. Okay, so for starters, I want to be able to access my colors that I have set up in this app. So I'm going to import my colors. And then along with that, I also want to have a data type that I can use for my app. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say I want to have a type and then my data type. And so you can either say data type, you can call it props type. It really doesn't matter what you call it because you're giving it a name. And so in this case, the value that I want to have being passed in as a prop is going to be the color of the separator. And I'm going to use my optional prop here, so that way if the user doesn't want to specify a color, they don't have to. So this is going to be an optional prop. And then down here in my list item separator code, because this is a functional component that does take in props, I'm going to use this notation, the react.fc for functional component, and then I'm going to put in my data type. So this is my props type that I'm using. And then in my parameter here, I'm going to type in color. Now, we've seen in other videos where we passed an entire like props type variable that had many different values in it, and we destructured the prop. Here, because it's just one value, that's not necessary. And so what I'm going to return is I'm going to return a view. I don't want to have any text here. And what I'm going to do for my view is I am going to essentially say how I want it to look. I'm going to start by creating a default style called separator. And for this, I'm essentially describing how I want my separator to look in between my rows. So I want it to span the whole width of the flat list. So I'm going to put that I want this to take up 100%. And then in terms of the height, I'm going to start with a small number. Let's start with 3 and see if we like how that looks. And then I'm going to go up here and I'm going to apply that to this view. And I'm going to say style equals styles.separator. Now, because I'm not going to have anything inside my view, I could, if I wanted, delete the closing tag and just use this self-closing syntax. That's always an option that I can use here. So if I were to go ahead and save this now, first of all, we're not going to see anything yet because we haven't assigned this prop to it. So before we haven't assigned this to the item separator for the flat list. But before we do that, let's go ahead and make this styles into an array of styles. So that way we have the ability to take in the color prop that the user may or may not pass in and use that to assign the color of our separator. So we are going to say that we want our background color to be equal to color or, and then here, this is where I'm going to pick a value from my colors file. So essentially what I'm saying here is that whatever text color I'm using here, if that's my default text color, I'll have that be the color for my separator unless the user passes something in. So if nothing is passed in and color doesn't have a value, then this will be my default value. All right, so we can go ahead and save this. And then now let's go back to our flat list. And then back on our flat list, we want to go ahead and we want to apply this. Now, like we talked about before, these are all of our props for FlatList, and I personally find that it's easiest to put the different props above render item just because I get tangled up in all these open and close things, and I find many students do as well. So I'm going to put my item separator component up here. Again, notice this is a capital I. That is a super common typo that people make. And I'm going to start out by just making it a default list item separator. And when I save this, I will now see my list item separator. Now, because of how I did my styling to have the margin below the item. If I were to comment that out and then resave it, I'm now going to see that I have that spacing in between each of these. Now, if I wanted to put just a teensy bit of margin, I could, and then that would give it a little extra look of the light gray showing through and then this color there. Now, let's say I didn't want to use the same color for the this item separator as that I have for my text. Well, then I could use the other notation to pass it in with a prop. So in this case, my syntax is a little bit more complicated. I have to have my open close parentheses, and then I have to use my arrow function. And then from here, I am going to open a parenthesis. I'm going to open my list item separator component and close it. And then in here, I'm going to say color equals, and then at this point, I'm going to use my accent color, which also comes from my colors doc. So I'm going to say colors dot flat list accent, and then I'm going to save. What am I missing here? Looks like I am missing a piece of syntax. I'm going to pause the video and find that. Okay, so looking closely at this, I discovered my my missing syntax here. So notice that my item separator opens a curly brace. I have the inner parentheses, arrow 2, and then I open a parenthesis, and I have to close that parenthesis right here before the closing curly brace. Now, when I save this, I'm not really seeing much of a difference, and that could just be because of the color that I chose here. Let me just go with a different color that I know will stand out. And that right there now changes that color. So essentially what we're seeing here is that we can either use our default setting or we can give the user the ability to pass in a color and go with it from there. All right, so I'm just going to real quick just recap all the different things that we talked about with the flat list. So for starters, our flat list has a data prop, which takes in an array of something. Now, in our case, we created an array of type data type, and my data type contained a unique identifier and a title. If I had more data values in my data type, I could just add more variables here, and then these objects would have more pieces here. Then I created a selected ID state variable to keep track of which item was currently selected. As I select a different item, the selected ID changes, and because I have used this extra data property, what that does is that tells my flat list to re-render whenever the value selected ID changes. So when I click on one of these and selected ID value changes, then the flat list will double check, hey, do I need to do anything to change my styling? This key extractor is how I know what the unique identifier is for each element, and this is telling me that for each item in this list, right, or in this array of type data type, I want to grab the item's ID, and that's going to be my unique identifier. Then I have my item separator component, and that is telling me what component I'm going to render in between each of the elements in my flat list. And then last, down here, I have my render item. And what render item is doing is this is saying for each item in my array data, what I want to do is I want to render all of this code. I want to have a touchable opacity so that when I press on it, I call my selected list function. And within that, I want to have a view that has a conditional background color. I want to have a text which has a conditional text color. And then what I want to have displayed is the title for the item itself. All right, in our next video, we're going to take a look at how we can take all of this code and turn it into its own component so that instead of having to have all of this inside my render item, I can just render another component called List Row or something of that matter. All right, I hope this has been helpful. Thank you.